every time I broadcast it, it's like going to private locked account. So nobody ever gets to watch it. So
You're like, ah.
I remember to unlock it. So now it should be good to go. Yay.
Okay. Because if not, I have to mess around on YouTube, and that's such a pain. So okay, I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
gonna verify this is good to go on YouTube,
Get this
and it's
open.
good to go.
I don't know if that's right, but okay.
Okay.
Awesome. I know we've had to like move up the show today, lots of things going on, but this is just how it is, right? With
That's
like
right.
moms and professionals and trying to do everything. We make it work, right?
Yes, we do. Adjust that schedule and be flexible.
That's right. That's right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, good. I know we want to talk about feedback today. This is kind of a topic that probably, I mean, we've both had like different experiences with it over the years. So I'm going to start with a question, and this is something that I'm genuinely curious about because when I was in the military, we always talked about feedback. I thought we were kind of horrible at it from like a leadership perspective. It was something that I think we grew up in pilot training and just being an air crew member that like this debrief, right, was a big part of how we ran those scenarios and how we learned and got better. But what is the status currently of this 360 feedback that I heard we were going to try to do in the military so that you get more than just the supervisor supervisee feedback, but like leaders can actually get feedback from people below them?
Yeah. So I don't know the policy like across the Air Force or the DoD necessarily. I know that it's an option that you can request, and for some of the programs that I work here at the academy, we have requested that for our commanders so that they get that opportunity. Because as you're alluding to, like feedback is meant to be this all inclusive gift of information so that you know sort of how you're performing and what's working and not working for not just the people you work for, but the people that you work with and then the people that work for you. And so, yes, that's an opportunity for people to get. And I think that, that's a formal way to do it. The thing about the 360 that I do like is, and I remember it was an option when I was a commander, not for me, but I remember some of the other squadron commanders. And it was kind of nice because it gave you, in some sense, an anonymous way, or the people that worked for you, an anonymous way to give you feedback. And I think that can be really nice too. So I think there's like two things here. Anonymous feedback, which is just giving you sort of, it's like, hey, I don't want to really engage in this conversation with you, but I want you to know this. It keeps people safe, and I guess that allows them to be honest. But the kind of feedback too that I think is like the one that you really have to practice is, how do you give feedback person to person? Like, how do you do that? And I would like to think that we could provide some tips and tricks about, well, what does that look like, right? And you can I got feedback, a lot of feedback this week from the people that work for me. And it was incredibly nice and professional, but it was, hey, we really need you to step up and do this thing. Like, we need you to do these things. Like, we see you're busy with these things. We're going to need you to do these things. And it was really, you know what I mean? It was humbling, but also helpful.
Yeah. And I feel like at this point in your career, I know in my career as well, I have a different perspective on feedback. Like, I think I used to see it in like a threatening way of, in some way, shape, or form. Like, it was people calling me out and my weaknesses on, display for everyone to kind of hear and see. And that was hard for me because I took it as this very personal attack.
Yes.
Instead of, I think now I see feedback completely differently. Because I see it as data points, right? That's all it really is. Like, it's not this definition of me or my character or my performance. It can actually be used as data points to help me improve and get better. But I do think there are different ways to give feedback. But before I get into that, like, have you felt like over time you've had a different feedback loop around the concept?
Yeah, or maybe how I felt about feedback. Just like you said, I think when you're younger and you're less comfortable in who you think you are and what you think you do, whatever, feedback can be threatening. But I think that is a learned skill, right? And I know we're going to talk about giving feedback and we're going to talk about getting feedback, because both of those are learned skills, right? And I think pilot training is a great example, or any air crew brief and debrief. It's a great example of what it means to just be quiet and listen to what someone has to say about you, right? And your feelings can and probably will get hurt. That's a fair point. But it's like that exercise in getting information and then deciding what you're going to do about that. And I think that's great. You know what I mean? I'm very glad that we grew up in a world that, even though that was hard and harsh, I felt like that prepared me for life a little bit better. Like, now I get feedback. I'll be honest with you. A lot of times I get like formal feedback, and it's like, you're doing amazing. Good job. You're great. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not even worth my time, because I'm like, well, I know I'm not amazing. I know I'm not doing a good job. Like, I know I'm doing a good enough job, but I know there's areas of improvement. It's like, people just don't want to say it. So I don't know. I kind of, in some ways, miss that just honest feedback. How about you?
So giving feedback has been interesting to me because I've done some research on it. In fact, when I started working with Pete Carroll, I learned some really interesting things from him, and how he's run the feedback loops on the Seattle Seahawks primarily, which actually, when you speak of pilot training, it kind of goes against some of the ways we grew up in this pilot training environment, because I felt like a lot of times it was, constructive, right? We use that word and then you can kind of say whatever you want after it. Like constructive feedback, like here's all the things you kind of sucked at. Here were your weak areas. But we were operating in an environment where like lives are on the line, right? Like you actually do need to learn how to land the plane, and you do need to know the systems behind emergencies that could potentially happen. So it's a little bit of a different environment, but I think just really harp on this negative weakness so much, to the detriment of the strengths-based approach, which I think is something that I've learned in the research that works in leadership environments and organizations, and in particularly elite sport. Okay. Pete would always say, if the kicker, the field goal kicker missed the game-winning field goal, he doesn't need to give him feedback on why missing that field goal took the team down, or didn't we didn't win the game, or how awful it was that you didn't make the point, right? Because they already know that. Most people understand those weak areas where they're at. So he uses this strength-based approach, which was completely foreign to me when I first was introduced to it, where you focus on the strengths of the individual, and then you also use this improvement pace of conversation. Instead of harping on those negative things, can we focus on the things that went well, and then let the other person give the feedback of where their weak areas were, or where do you think you could improve for next time, which then invites the conversation to address the weak spots. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I think that's a great idea, right? But I think that works best when you have that elite side of person that knows, right? I can see that. That's a great idea. And honestly, I think back to when I wrote my dissertation, and you might remember when you're writing yours, and people would give you feedback, and it would just be soul crushing, because it was so hard, and it was hard to write, and it was hard to do all this work. And then they'd make all these corrections. And my dad did a lot of my edits, and he would always write a very positive, good job, I loved reading this, or whatever. And I just remember being thank you so much. I need that positive part of it too, because I know I'm not. I think the difference is positive feedback versus kind of cheerleading. That's the difference. One is actual feedback, and one is just sort of paying very superficial difference. But I am curious to know if you could do positive feedback in a skill that someone's really still learning the skill. In your example of the Seahawks, they know how to do this, if they just aren't performing. And I wonder if that works better in that environment vice, hey, I'm trying to teach you a skill, and I need you to know that was dangerous what you just did. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the environment depends, right? When we do talk about, in a lot of our world, it's lives on the line. So there isn't really a lot of space or maneuverability for error, versus in other environments where you can let people fail and you can let them make mistakes. And then instead of saying, you suck, here's all the things you did wrong, turning it into, okay, that didn't go exactly as we wanted it to go. But what did we learn from the experience? And then letting them pull that conversation. But you're right. In elite environments where people are really good, they are going to have some of that self-awareness to understand their own weak areas. I think some of these conversations with people learning a new skill, as long as we stay out of like the life or death kind of training environments, but like if you're talking leadership in that learning environment, sometimes the data points and the information are like, this is not the path for the person. And I don't think we do that enough, right? Like, I don't think we do that enough in our feedback to say, hey, if you can't get self-awareness around this skill set, or there aren't a lot of strengths that we can pull right here, maybe you're in the wrong environment. Maybe you're in the wrong position. Maybe you're in the wrong career field. And I think we want to try so hard to make everybody fit, that we struggle with that type of honesty and the feedback we're dealing with.
So how would you approach that then? Like let's first start with the giving of feedback, and then we'll talk about the receiving of it. So when you have to give tough feedback, like, right. And again, it might just be required for whatever reason, you need to be critiquing somebody. How do you get it? Like, how do you frame it? How do you mentally prepare yourself? What would you suggest?
So honestly, and this is what I've learned from Pete and the coaching that I do now, like at the executive C-suite level, you have to let them lead the conversation, right? So I craft the right types of questions to get to the feedback I want to get to, instead of preparing like a document where it's like, here's all the things that they messed up on or their weekend, and I'm going to make sure I address them all. I offer this kind of coaching conversation where I want to get them to understand and build that self-awareness around where that weak area is. So that's how I really prepare, is by creating the right questions to ask in that feedback session.
And is it like, what kind of questions? Is it something like, hey, where do you think that you're struggling right now with this skill set or with this job or something like that?
Yeah, like asking or pointing out, like if there's some specific example that like using Pete's example of like, missing the game winning play or whatever it was. Instead of me doing the play-by-play of how that happened and what I saw, I would start by saying, okay, what was your experience? How did you feel, right, in those last moments? Like, what was going on in your head? Because a lot of times, and we've talked a lot about like the inner critic, we've talked a lot about the narratives inside our head. A lot of times, if you step back from a experience that didn't go as well as we wanted it to, a lot of times we were stuck inside our heads and we didn't know the skills or tool sets or tools to get out. Yeah. So
you're trying to identify the patterns of thinking so that you can help them move out of a negative or a detrimental path into something that would be more successful.
Absolutely. Because we know from the research that like, if I just did something like lose the game or I made a big mistake, even if I'm not completely self-aware of all of it, there is going to be a little bit of a gut punch, right? Like, I know I sucked at that. I know I didn't do very well. And if I, as the person giving the feedback, just focus on that, they're just going to go in this more deep spiral, and there's no learning or growth from that space, right? So it's like resetting the mental space that they come into the conversation with, so then we can move forward and in an improvement way instead of like backwards, right? In a reflective way.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I have to get into a mindset of the focus is on the mission or the objective or the task we were trying to achieve. And it is not personal. There is no, I'm not trying to attack you as a human being. I'm trying to get to hey, what's the root cause? And I think that that helps me to keep myself very clean in the conversation. And if it starts to get, if people get upset or their feelings get hurt, is to remind them, hey, this is not a critique of you as a human being. It's a critique of the way that this played out. And that way we're focused on the events and not the people. I think that has been like really important in my military career, is to keep it about what happened, not about the people that did it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I love that concept. That's, the research will also tell us feedback tends to be well received when you focus on the outcome, right? As that's where the negative like improvement language goes. But then the process and the people, you do kind of tend to separate, right?
Yeah.
Like make sure it's very clear. I mean, even when I would kick out airmen, as a commander, I always asked at the very end or had a conversation around, this doesn't have to define you, right? Like you didn't pass PT tests, you're not a fit person in the Air Force's standards, but that doesn't mean that now for the rest of your life, you're the definition of who you are, right? Or if you made a big mistake, right, then committed a crime and now you're on your way out for those reasons, that there is a chance to rehabilitate, to reflect on that and move forward from it.
Yeah, I think that's so important to kind of take the onus away from them as an attack on a human being and the conversations about the thing that might have happened. What about when when they start to get emotional, right? When people start to get defensive or, you know what I mean? Like start to take it really negatively, and you can see that it's not a fruitful conversation. What do you think about, what do you do in that case?
So that scenario reminds me of the many times I've been a flight instructor with someone in the seat next to me, and you finally are just like, you're out. Like, get out of the seat, go take some deep breaths. Because there comes a point when someone gets so defensive or starts to feel so threatened by the conversation that learning stops, right? Like a wall is put up. There's no longer an effective way of communicating in that scenario. And sometimes it could just be like removing yourself from the situation, taking those, I'm obviously a big believer in like taking deep breaths, getting a reset of our minds, and then re-evaluating, or re-attacking the conversation. So I think that's really important, but a lot of leaders don't even have the awareness that that's happening with the person that they're giving the feedback to. And so I think that is a skill set in and of itself too, to be like that aware in those moments, to create that space to then, take those deep breaths, get in the right mindset, and then come back and have the conversation. And a lot of times it could be like the way the conversation starts, which is why I don't start with like, here's all the things you did wrong. When you start by asking the right question, I think then it becomes, right, like then they have ownership of the situation a little, and the feedback process, which I think makes for an overall better strategy. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're no longer giving feedback. Like when someone gets emotional and defensive, the feedback part's over. And so you continuing to talk is like, it's doing damage, I think. So I guess part of the conversation actually is when you're giving feedback, you need to make sure that it's in an environment that's well received. And so by asking those questions, you're setting an environment that this can be a fruitful conversation. And as soon as you see this is not a fruitful conversation, you might, like you said, take a pause or take, a long pause and then decide how you might approach that differently. But that's happened to me a lot. In fact, this week with some of my students, we gave them a lot of rope and that they can plan this event, and they just didn't meet the need of the exercise we were planning. And at some point, one of the people I work with, one of the other senior leaders, he goes, he told them, he goes, okay, I have the aircraft. Like, we're done. You're done. I have the aircraft. And that's what we would say to a student in a plane. Like, you're done right now. I'm going to take this because you would need a break, or you're doing something dangerous or whatever. And I mean, they hung their heads, they argued with us, all kinds of stuff. And that's when I was like, I'm just going to walk away because I'm getting physically upset. Like, I'm getting angry with them, and it was no longer fruitful. And it actually took us 2 days to like separate, decide what we wanted to do as the instructors so that we could better help them as the students. But it was tough. It was really, really tough. And I wish I had recognized much sooner that I was in a bad space, like that it was not a fruitful conversation. So it's really tough. Now let's go on the flip side. So now you're on the receiving end, right? So what are some of the things you do, regardless of what kind of feedback you're getting? What are some of the things that you would do so that you can still be open to feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's something that I've learned as well, being more in a public space. You can't take every bit of feedback with the same quality, right, behind it. So I have a small circle of people who I really genuinely care about their feedback, and I value it. And I hope that we could have this trusted relationship so that I can give them feedback. They can give me feedback. Like my husband is one. I would consider you, on that short list of people that will be the ones that, hey, Janelle, let's reel this in, or here's some honest feedback about what's going on. But there's a lot of people in the cheap seats, right? I talk a lot about this in the mindset training I do. Should you really care about random people's thoughts or feedback for you? And I think we have a culture right now where I don't really I would even kind of delineate that that's just noise. Feedback has to come from a relationship that's meaningful, right? Nice. So that's how, because I get asked that all the time. And believe me, there's a comment on my TED Talk right now that every time I look at it gets me angry, right? I get activated from it, because he said something you're a horrible mom because you worked and flew airplanes and left your kids, right? Something like that. That is just somebody's split second opinion of me based on what I said in my TED Talk and being in a uniform at the time, and just their impression. But it'll still, right, these random cheap seats noise will still sometimes really affect you, and especially your mindset. So I make it very clear. I try to do my best to delineate between feedback that's from meaningful relationships that I have with people and feedback that's just noise.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because there is so much feedback that we get on a daily basis. And I was thinking of formal feedback, but you're right. All the informal feedback that we get, that can really play sort of mind tricks on you. I think back to, I gave a course and they did a post-course, assessment, and 2 students out of the 50 were like, I didn't like this course. I didn't like her. And I was devastated, oh, they didn't like me. And then 48 people were like, it was a great class. I loved it. But you focus on the negative. So I think that's a great point. Think about what is feedback and what is just information that you might consider or not consider. That's a really good one. I was also thinking about from a feedback perspective.
I don't know what mine was because.
So I was mentioning that the people I work with this week were saying, hey, we really need you to focus on this, and you're kind of focusing on this. Well, they didn't say it outright. They were saying oh, it's hard to get a hold of you because you're busy with these other things. And this is still, could you let me know what you think about this chapter we wrote for this book? And I was stopped, and I thought, oh my gosh, they're trying to give me feedback here to say, do your job, don't do your job. And I thought that was great. So I stopped and I said, oh my gosh, thank you so much for that feedback. And I was trying to say, I know you wouldn't stop me outright, but I wish you would. I wish sometimes you would stop me outright. And I guess make an environment where I let them know, I hear you, I hear that feedback, and I'm sorry, I messed up. I missed the mark here. Because you're talking about 360 feedback. I don't always have to get somebody to give me a formal feedback, and I don't have to ask them. I think that's the hardest thing when people go, well, I hope you'll tell me how you think I'm doing. And you're like, yeah, you're my boss, so no, I'm not trusting that I can just tell you. And so I don't know. So in there some ways, I think as a boss, there's a chance where you can, get feedback informally and then make sure they know. That was helpful. Thank you for telling me that. Yeah.
Yeah, in the world I operate in, it's more now informal feedback. I will say the formal feedback chains, during my 20 years in the military, I maybe had a supervisor 3 times that actually took it seriously and gave me formal feedback. So I never really felt like that was a big part of my development. But when I became a leader, I did take it very seriously. There's a feedback form you were supposed to fill out, and I would bring people in. I would ask a lot of questions. That's how I learned a lot about the people who worked for me, right? What were their goals and dreams, and, how I could help. I always saw my position as a leader to remove the barriers for the people that worked for me so that they could do their jobs better. And so those feedback opportunities were ways for me to give them expectations, and also kind of outlining their strengths and maybe a few of those areas for improvement. But more importantly, to start the conversation around how I could be a better leader, and how we could have a better culture within our organization that, is moving forward instead of stuck or stagnant.
Yeah, I think there's place for formal and there's place for informal. I'm less comfortable with the formal feedback. It feels stuffy, it feels forced. And the questions that were on that form, like I remember giving people feedback and getting feedback because I still do it. And it's just like, I mean, it's so generic. And I can be like, I expect you to come to work. Of course you're going to. Like, these are senior people in the Air Force. They're like, I've been doing this 20 years also. Like, I know what you need me to do. But there's places where I'm like, actually, I need you to, do this thing. Like, I need you to let me know when these things aren't happening, or I need you to let me know when, you're not getting the resources or whatever. And that one for me is like, that has to be a continuous thing. It can't be once every 6 months or something like that. So it's tough.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's like a check, like a checked box, right?
Yeah.
More than a relationship, which I think is also where we get confused between like mentoring and feedback and coaching. And we throw out a lot of these words, and I think a lot of people don't understand the differences between them. I think we've muddied the waters a lot, especially in the military space, because we just expect if you're in a leadership position, then you're required to give feedback and you should also be mentoring, right? But they don't give any type of like, here's how you do that, except for learn from the guy or gal before you, which I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of bad examples that I learned from in my career.
How do you see the difference between mentoring and feedback? Like, what's in your mind the difference?
So I think that feedback has a specific outcome attached to it, or it's about an outcome. Whereas I think mentoring can be more, it's almost like, strategy and like the tactics and operational space of what we do. When we give feedback, we're talking more specifics. When we give mentoring, there's some art to it, right? Like there's an art to the relationship that's developed. There's a choice in those relationships versus a feedback relationship can just be supervisor-supervisee, which most of us don't choose. So I think that's kind of how I would delineate between those two relationships. What do you think?
So it's interesting. Rob just sent me a text as we're talking. He's like, mentoring is a relationship and a journey. It's that idea that, hey, I'm gonna, you know what I mean? We're gonna cultivate this as we go along. I often think of mentorship too as like, let me show you what could be. Let me show you what's out there so that you can put it in perspective. Whereas feedback is specific to an event, a task, a job, or whatever, and a paper. Like today, I graded a whole bunch of papers for my students, and I was giving them feedback on the paper, and then I'm making them rewrite the paper. Because I think another thing, an aside, is that we aren't very good at iterating, right? We don't teach people like, I'm going to give you feedback or a critique, and then you're going to fix it, and then you're going to come back, and then I'm going to tell you how you did in fixing it, right? Like I know for youth, my students here at the Academy, I give them feedback, and then they just take their paper, done, that thing's done. You know what I mean? So there's like this loop that I think we need to bring into. But for sure, I think mentorship is more about the relationship, and feedback is more about the thing, right? I'm giving you information about what happened with that thing. You probably do give some feedback in a mentoring relationship, and you probably give some mentoring in feedback. I think, you know what I mean? There's both. Yeah. But I think of it bigger picture relationship for sure.
Absolutely. I have a question for you, and I know we're getting close to our end of time here. Have you found it different to give or receive feedback as a female in a male-dominated profession?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and I don't know if it's in a male-dominated or just in the society writ large, right? I have found like I have to couch it much better. Like when I'm too direct. And I was talking with another professor here at the Academy, and she's from the State Department. And she was saying yesterday in a panel discussion that we were both on, she was like, I have to be careful because I'm very direct. You know what I mean? And when I'm working at embassies, you have to be careful because the way they see women can be so different at different, cultures and different countries. And I was like, well, I think that's true even in the United States. Like we have to be very careful that we don't come across too harsh or too direct in that, because, and then for whatever reason, I'm sensitive to the way that the person's receiving it. Like I think it's been ingrained in me that I need to make sure that the other person's okay with my feedback. So you know what I mean? And I think that that's kind of been instilled in me my whole life. Like, make sure you don't make people too uncomfortable. Make sure that you're, paying attention to those other people. And that can be good, but that can also be bad. Like, in some ways, I'm like, no, this is a one-way conversation. I'm giving you feedback, like to those cadets. We're done here. This is my feedback to you. So yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I've noticed differently, like during my career and then now. One thing that's been really interesting is, so when I wore my uniform as a lieutenant colonel with my PhD already, sitting at a table, there would be times when people would be like, gosh, we need like a PhD expert in here. Like, where is one? And I'd literally be like, that's me. Like, I am. And I could be very, I would try to be direct in my feedback. I would try, and it always came off as, ugh, too harsh. Why is she, like making comments on this? This is not her lane, whatever. Now I've literally changed my clothes. I'm out of that uniform. Now instead of being a PhD or a pilot with PhD experience and research behind her belt, I'm now a doctor who happened to have been a pilot and a military leader in the past. People are all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, like, yes, give us feedback. Like, tell me like how I can improve my life as a leader. Tell me about leadership and human performance and mindset and professionalism. And it's just amazing to me that dynamic shifted so strongly with just the clothes, right? I wore, and instead of Lieutenant Colonel Macaulay PhD, I'm now Dr. Macaulay, who Lieutenant Colonel retired, right? So that's been an interesting transition for me on how people take feedback from me or how we have those relationships.
I think that that's really interesting, right? Like, in my job, I know I can give certain feedback and say certain things because I do wear a uniform. And I know that our civilian professors can't do and say certain things because, the students or the military members won't pay attention. So there's something to that too, like the expectation of the person receiving it as to how qualified you are to give that feedback. Yeah. And that can be really frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. With the male female thing, I always felt like, the feedback that I received was not direct to me. I don't know if you ever felt that. Like, when I had male bosses, I felt like they could never really give me direct feedback. There would just be this indirect way that I would then hear that I had pissed someone off or I had done something wrong. Yet if you talk to them, more face to face, like they would just kind of skirt the issue. And so that's kind of what I felt like as a woman in the military a lot of times, or the feedback was biased because of my gender. Like, I don't know if you remember, we'd have these old Vietnam veteran sim instructors, right? Like back in pilot training. And I'd have like this kick-ass flight, and this instructor would be like, oh my God, you're struggling so much. Like, you're lucky you're here for a girl. And then the next time I'd have a different instructor and I have like the worst flight ever. And he'd be like, oh, you're good for a girl. Like, you're until I make it through this program. And so I couldn't win, right? Like, I couldn't win on the feedback I would receive. So what I learned early on is to just anchor on like what I think is the right thing to do, what I think is the right way to perform and bring my full self to each job that I was given, and to not take every single bit of feedback, whether it was indirect or direct, as the end all be all, right? They're all just data points. That's kind of where I am.
And back to that, I have a list of people I trust, and that might be, hey, in this, discipline or in this area of study, this is who I trust, and I'll ask them for honest feedback. Because I have had the same experience where I've just gotten feedback that's like, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great. And then later you find out, yeah, that person thought you were terrible. My daughter plays sports, and she got feedback like, everything's good, everything's good, everything's good. And then when it came time to put the team together, she wasn't on the team. And she was like, why didn't you tell me? I don't understand. Like, why didn't you have the backbone to be honest with me? And I guess my last comment would say this, clarity is kindness. I think that's something that Brene Brown says, like, clear is kind. Be very clear with people, because that's actually the kindest thing that you can do with the people that you work with, for, or that work for you. If you can just be as clear and as honest as you can, that really will help long term. The people that just say, you're doing great, and then, yeah, no, I didn't put you up for that promotion. That's like, that's devastating because you never had the chance to fix it. So that'd be mine, is like, stop shirking responsibilities if you really do have a problem with the person.
That is so true. That's a great line to end on, which I think gets at, the root of where a lot of feedback fails, right? We're unwilling to be clear in what the feedback means. And by skirting around it, right, we're not doing anyone any favors. So, no, and I think in this whole idea of mentorship, this creating lift and lifting others, I think giving having the right kinds of conversations, focusing in the right way on the feedback, and then ultimately all of this comes down to having clear communication and trusted relationships in the end. And so I know that's what a lot of our whole idea behind this podcast is to cultivate those conversations and lift each other up in a really positive way.
Yeah. Well, thanks. This was good. We'll see everybody next week.
Yep. Email us at creatinglift98, right, at gmail.com, or join us on the podcast next week. Thanks, everybody.
All right. We'll see you later. See you next week.